Hello and welcome to this revision video for GCSE Edexcel Paper 1 Crime and Punishment and Whitechapel. The paper is split into two parts. The first part is section A, which is on Whitechapel. So this revision lesson is based on the Edexcel specification. I've tried to keep it nice and focused on that. And the first thing you need to know is about the local context. So population of 30,000 people. Majority of the population are very poor. This is one of the poorest parts of London. 1,000 people were homeless. Gangs were very powerful. So for example, the Bessarabian Tigers and the Odessians, they make money a lot of the time using extortion. So they'll threaten businesses, say shops in the local area, and they will say, if you don't give us money, we will essentially damage your property or your shop. So they're getting money. It's called a protection racket. Lots of pollution at times. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. There was so much pollution and smog in the area. Loads of factories in the East End of London, so hence the pollution. There's also a lack of sanitation, lack of healthy drinking water, and the sewers actually would run on the side of the streets as well. In terms of housing and overcrowding, slum housing was very common in the area, and these slum houses were called rookeries. Some rookery buildings were several stories. 30 people could share one house or flat, so very overcrowded. You could also go and stay the night or stay for a few hours in a lodging house. I think about these as being the worst hotels in the world. You would only usually pay for an 8-hour shift. There were 200 of these in the area, and the conditions were very, very, very poor, dirty and crowded. In some cases, you didn't actually get a bed. You were given a piece of rope that you could lean on and to sleep on it like that. Now, there were some attempts to improve housing in Whitechapel. The Peabody estate is an example of that. This is a block of flats. There were 286 flats, and it was seen to be improved accommodation. This was set up by a philanthropist called George Peabody, who wanted to help poorer people in London. The rents were not really cheap, but not really expensive either. It was quite reasonable. People could afford to pay for it. And some of the things that were seen to be improvements, there was better ventilation, so better quality air in the buildings, brick walls, and which meant that you didn't get fleas in the walls in the same way that you used to, shared laundry rooms to wash your clothes and stuff, and also you'd get shared bathrooms with a bath and shared kitchens. So each family doesn't get their own bathroom, but it was certainly better than having to share it with, say, like a whole street. Workhouses. Really, really poor people. People who might be on the brink of starvation, people who are so poor and really struggling, they would, as a last resort, go to a workhouse. This was set up in the 19th century, and this was set up by the government in order to just stop people dying on the street of starvation. They made them as harsh and as uncomfortable as possible because the government did not want people to get lazy, and the government did not want people to go to a workhouse unless they really needed to. So they get food and shelter at the workhouse. Old people, sick people, disabled people, orphans and unmarried mothers were common there. You'd have to do some manual labour. If you're old, you wouldn't have to do this. You'd have to wear a uniform, so it's a bit like a prison, and whole families were split up in there as well. There was a real lack of employment. So there was some employment at the Bell Foundry in the area. That's making stuff out of metal, and they made actually the bell for Big Ben. Sweater trades like tailoring, shoemaking and making matches were common, and sweater trades, usually the conditions there were pretty poor. There were poor conditions, and you'd often have to do long hours for very low wages. There are lots of sources that talk about how much there were fumes there, how the hours were really long and how tough the conditions were. You could also work in railway construction as labourers, or working on the docks. Docks were the part of East London where ships would arrive and leave, and often the dockers, the people working on the docks, would have to load and unload the ships. There's also a real lack of employment because there are economic problems, not just in Britain, but across the region and the world because of an economic depression, so there's more unemployment and a shortage of jobs. One thing I'd say about working on the docks, you might have a job as a docker, but you weren't guaranteed to get a set number of hours. So you could turn up to work one day and they'd say, sorry, we don't need you, and therefore you'd have to go home and you won't get paid for that day. The other thing is there's a real lack of jobs for women as well, hence the high number of women who are forced to turn to prostitution. So in terms of poverty, 36% of people in Whitechapel lived in poverty. There was poor housing, unemployment and low wages, and diseases were common such as diphtheria and dysentery. As a result of this, many people turned to alcohol to numb their pain in order to escape how tough their everyday existence was. And as a result, as well, people are so poor, they don't have money, they have to turn to crime in order to basically just survive. We call that survival crime, and also prostitution. There were over 1,200 prostitutes in the Whitechapel area alone. The other thing I'd say as well, the alcohol often leads to obviously people getting very, very drunk, and therefore assault and violence are common as a result of alcohol. So crime, violence is linked to alcohol. There were 1,200 prostitutes in the area. Prostitution was technically illegal. And there are also these protection rackets, these gangs who make money by getting money from businesses in exchange for protection. Bessarabian tigers and Edexcians are examples of gangs who made their money in this way. Lodging houses, we've talked about that. Dormitory style bunks for a few pence, or you could actually sleep upright on a rope, and often 8-hour shifts. Really dirty, unsanitary conditions, and they were usually pretty horrible, noisy, smelly places where actually you also got people discussing crime, criminal gangs planning stuff, etc. Pubs. There were 45 pubs on 1 mile of the Whitechapel Road. Loads and loads of pubs. Poverty was linked to alcoholism. People were poor. They wanted to try and escape, so they would drink alcohol to get drunk, so they would forget about how tough their lives were. There were also these places called gin palaces. Gin was much cheaper to buy than beer, and so actually lots of people would drink gin, and it was the cheapest way to get very, very drunk. So you get these places called gin palaces where you can get gin in particular. Drunkenness leads to violence and alcohol, and people are stealing in order to pay for alcohol, because people just get addicted to this alcohol and they're going to steal in order to get it. One of the key things about Whitechapel is we get this thing called a fluctuating population. It's not like in, say, medieval England where everyone knew one another. There's a very fluctuating population. People would sleep in different lodging houses each night or streets, so they wouldn't actually always know the people in the lodging house. Pubs attracted people from outside. People were just very anonymous in Whitechapel, which meant that they could commit a crime. Maybe someone would see them, but they wouldn't necessarily recognize them, and therefore it would be more difficult to catch them, let's say the next day or a week later. And people did not know their neighbours very well. So we call this sense of people being quite anonymous. It's linked to this fluctuating population. So immigration into Whitechapel. First group is Irish migration. Many of the Irish people were navigators, or known as navvies, because they were helping to build canals, roads and railways. They also were employed as dockers. Now the Irish people had a bit of a bad reputation. They had a reputation for drunkenness and violence as well. They also had a reputation for being terrorists, because there were a group of Irish nationalists who did not want Ireland to be part of the United Kingdom. They wanted Ireland to be its own independent country, and in order to try and convince the British government to give them this independence, they were launching terrorist attacks. So for example, Dynamite Saturday in 1885, there were bombs across London. For example, they'd be bombing tube trains and places. Their bomb went off in like Trafalgar Square as well. The second immigrant group is Jewish people. They're coming from Eastern Europe, so the former Russian Empire. So we're looking at modern day countries such as Russia, Ukraine and Poland. So from the 1880s, many of these Jewish people living in the Russian Empire are being persecuted. The Tsar, the leader, has been assassinated there, and they're actually blaming Jewish people. So many Jewish people in the 1880s come to Whitechapel. These are very poor people, some of the poorest people in Europe, and therefore when they come to London, they can't really afford to live anywhere else, so they go to Whitechapel because it was one of the cheapest areas to live in. When they moved to London, many of the Jewish people who don't speak English necessarily, they would actually try and find other Jewish people living there, and they would move to that exact area. So as a result, we get some parts of Whitechapel which are 90% Jewish. Now, these Jewish people did sometimes stand out. They spoke a different language, Yiddish. They had cultural differences. The way that they dressed was different as well. And obviously, they're a different religion. Now, some of the Jewish people, when they moved into Whitechapel, they set up businesses, and actually they did quite well. So some of the local people who were already there were jealous and resented their success. People were also annoyed that some Jewish people were so poor and desperate because they've come from Eastern Europe. They were just prepared to accept any job, even if the wages were lower. And so some of the people already there were saying, oh, they're taking our jobs because they're able to they're accepting lower wages. The other thing that annoyed some of the local Christians was that the Jewish people worked on a Sunday, and that was the holy day for Christians. So some of them thought, oh, they're taking business, or they just thought they were being, disrespectful to Christians. Socialism. Now, socialism is being taken out of the specification, so I actually won't spend too long on this, but socialists want the government to do more to help poorer people. Anarchists, they're people who do not think that government in any sense or government is actually ever good, and that actually they did not believe that organised government was good, and they believed that essentially humans could organise themselves fine and actually more efficiently without government getting in the way. So H division, they are the police force that have to deal with all of this mess which I've just described. So much crime, so much poverty. So some of the other problems they face: the rookeries, the alleys and the courts. It was really easy for criminals to get away because there's loads of alleyways. Alcohol was a problem, prostitution, gangs, violent demonstrations. Jewish people are being attacked as well, so the police are having to deal with that. Locals didn't always trust the police because the police were sometimes seen as representing the government, and there were a few times where the police actually treated protesters quite badly. So for example, in 1887 in Trafalgar Square, some people were protesting against the government and the police actually attacked the protesters. So people were thinking, these police are not on our side, they've actually attacked us. So sometimes the police would ask people for witness statements. They would ask people to say, oh, were you there? Did you see this? And sometimes people would say, I'm not helping the police. Another group is the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. So during the Jack the Ripper murders in the autumn of 1888, people were scared to go to Whitechapel. People did not want to go and spend their money in Whitechapel. They literally just stayed away because they're worried that if they go to Whitechapel, they could be the next victim. So as a result, local business owners were losing money and they were angry. So what they decided to do, they thought the police weren't doing a good enough job. So what they did was they joined together and they said, we are going to try and catch the Ripper ourselves. So they did two things to do that. First of all, they offered a financial reward for information about the murders. Now, the police made a conscious decision not to offer a reward because they were worried that the people in Whitechapel would come up with false information in order to just get the money. But the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee do this. They say, actually, we are going to offer a reward. And the other thing they did was they patrolled the street at nights, making lots of noise, hoping they're going to put off the Ripper murderer from committing his next murder. And I think it's fair to say this did not necessarily help the police. They just encouraged time wasters with the reward. So what the police do to try and investigate crimes in Whitechapel. This part of the course, it's almost like pretty self-explanatory. They would go to the crime scene and they would either sketch the crime scene, and if they had a camera on hand, they would take a photograph of the crime scene. That means that they can look for potential clues later on, even when the crime scene's been cleared. So they did this, for example, they took photos of Mary Jane Kelly's body, one of the victims. The other thing, they would interview people. They would look for eyewitnesses in the area, people who live locally, people who were nearby at the time, and they would try and get information from that. They also tried to really think about who this killer might be. So they're really thinking about constructing a criminal profile. So for example, they thought the way that the bodies were in terms of the way that they'd been cut, they thought maybe this killer is left-handed. They thought that the person could be a middle-aged man, unemployed, etc. So as a result, they were focusing their search on interviewing people who fitted this profile. Other techniques, they would use post-mortems, so they would be looking at the bodies of the victims to try and work out, so like get some clues as to how the person's been murdered. Soup kitchens, this was clever. People did not trust the police, so what they do as a result is they set up soup kitchens, and they're hoping that they can build trust with the local community that way. As they're giving away this free food, they're hoping that people might actually give them some information. Using coroner's reports, so looking at to see people who have studied the bodies to see what they've said. And also the other thing is they visited lunatic asylums. We would call that now a mental health hospital, but they were looking to see if maybe if the times that the murders had taken place, maybe someone had left the asylum, and they were trying to see if there's a pattern there. There wasn't. Another problem that they face is Whitechapel is right on the border between two police forces areas. So we've got the Metropolitan Police, which does the majority of London, the City of London Police, and then Scotland Yard, which is kind of ahead of like the detective unit of the police. So first of all, the police forces did not always share information. The Jack the Ripper case was huge, and there was this like competition for the different police forces to be the force to catch Jack the Ripper, and as a result, sometimes they did not want to give information to the other police force because they're thinking, that might actually help them and they might be the one that finds the Ripper. So there's this competition and lack of complete clear communication between the two police forces. There's an example of this. So next to one of the bodies, there was some anti-Semitic graffiti written on the wall. You might remember seeing this. It was, "The Jews are not to be blamed for nothing." Don't quote me on that. That's not the exact quote, but it's something along those lines. And some people were thinking, that seems quite anti-Semitic. Now, the City of London wanted to photograph the graffiti and to use it for potential evidence in the future. But Warren, who was head of the Met Police, he said, no, this is anti-Semitic. We might actually encourage more people to be attacking Jewish people, anti-Semitic violence. We cannot do that. So he just said, wash it off. So this is an example of them not working together. And some of the bodies were actually found in the City of London zone. So it did create this confusion between the two police forces. And also, Charles Warren, who's head of the Met Police, is actually clashing with the Home Secretary, who runs the whole of policing and prisons in Britain. So look, they're not always completely cooperating in this period. The media as well are causing problems. So the media were really interested in the Jack the Ripper case, and people across Britain were buying newspapers simply because there were reports on Jack the Ripper. So the media, in some of their reporting, were exaggerating some of the details. They were publishing some ideas and claims that weren't actually being confirmed by the police. So the newspapers were saying, the killer must be foreign, whereas the police didn't actually think that, and it didn't help the investigation. They also published letters signed by someone claiming to be the Ripper, and in some cases this did not actually help the investigation. The police also, as a result of what the media were doing, they did not completely work with the media, and there was a lack of trust between them both. So actually the media were not helping the police and vice versa. So some of the stuff that you need to know about the Met Police. So it's been set up by Robert Peel in 1829. This was the police for London, and it was divided into divisions. So the police force that are in charge of Whitechapel is called H Division. CID. This is set up in 1878. This is the Criminal Investigations Department. It's like the detective element of policing. It had 216 officers. They, in a similar way to the Met Police, were criticised for the Jack the Ripper case failure. They had more of a focus on solving crimes, and they were investigating crimes. So like their aim is, they're not aiming to catch the Ripper or to catch any criminals red-handed. They're hoping that after a few days, after a week or so, they will actually be able to look for clues to be able to catch the person later on. Home Secretary. The Home Secretary was in control of the Met Police. They're in charge of law and order in Britain, and they appointed the head of the Met Police. So Charles Warren, he was head of the Met Police in this period. He'd used the army to put down Trafalgar Square protest, remember the Bloody Sunday in 1887. He's forced to resign after the criticism of his work in the Jack the Ripper case, and he works closely with the Home Secretary. Quality of police recruits. So, being a police constable or working for the police in this period was seen as an average to good job. It didn't have the best pay, but also it didn't have the worst pay. It wasn't like working in, say, sweated trades. There is an issue for the police at first. They get a really low standard of recruits. they would get 2 weeks only of military drill training, 1 week of patrol training, and then they were just expected to start working. Many of them were sacked for drunkenness. And so there was real problems for the Met Police at first. People were being really critical, saying, you've not got good enough people working for you. After 1869, the police realised they have to try and improve this. So they are trying to teach new recruits reading and writing to illiterate police. And also in 1888, they do introduce some quite tough rules. You have to be aged between 21 to 32, be at least 5'9", be literate so you can read or write, and have only 2 children and not to run a business on the side. So they're hoping that they're going to have no distractions, be quite young, be relatively tall, intelligent, educated, and not have loads of children and distractions. So the beat constable. These are the common police constables, the bog standard constables, people working for the police. So they've got a very simple job. If they see someone committing a crime or getting involved in a crime, they just arrest them. They're trying to deter criminals by being visible and active in the local area. They're hoping that's going to put criminals off committing crime. They would have a specific route in the area that they would have to walk along, and if it's a really dangerous part of, say, Whitechapel, they'd have a second constable with them. But the thing is, criminals ended up memorising the routes, and so they'd know where the beat constable would be at what time. Okay. So public attitudes towards the police. Some said the police were too much like an army. They had a reputation for violence after the 1887 Trafalgar Square protest. They were seen as incompetent during the Ripper case, but some people did see the police as necessary. So, some questions that they could ask you. You're going to start off the paper, and they could ask you a very simple question at first, something like, describe one feature of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. This, you just write 2 sentences, 1 feature, and a supporting bit of detail. This part of the course, you're just showing off. You're just showing off that you've done some revision about all of the stuff I've just talked about. And then you get a second part to this question where you then have to describe a feature of something else. So here, it could be like the work of H Division policing Whitechapel. You could talk about here the beat constable, you could talk about the soup kitchens, you could talk about some of the things they did during the Ripper investigation, etc. Then the next question you have on this paper, section A, is the 8-mark source utility question. Now, we use the IDOPJ formula for this. So first of all, you make the inference. What can you learn from the source about this inquiry? Detail. Refer to what you see or read in the source. What in the source makes you infer this? Then bring in some own knowledge. You've got to think. From what you've seen in the source, does your own knowledge support or challenge what is in the source? And provenance. You look at the information about who's produced it, what kind of thing it is, whose perspective it is, and you think, is that useful or not? And then just have an overall judgment about it. And remember, you're going to do this IDOPJ for both sources. So, for example, if we were having a question on workhouses in Whitechapel, you could get 2 sources and you have to think, what do you learn about workhouses in Whitechapel? Do you have any own knowledge to support that, etc. Now, the next part of the course is you then have to think about how you could follow up a detail from one of the sources. So, the detail is going to be in a written source. The detail is a quotation, so something that's written in the source. If it's a visual source, say like a photograph or a cartoon, you would just do something that you could see. So, you pick out something that you think, that's interesting, and it's got to be linked to the inquiry. Then your question, it must be linked to this detail. And a typical question could be, was this typical or common in Whitechapel? So, for example, if a source is saying that in a workhouse there were terrible, terrible conditions and people were dying, you'd say, okay, was this common for people to die in a workhouse? That could be a great question you could ask for that. And a type of source that you could use. Now, so look, it's expected that you know a bunch of sources. That's part of the specification, and I've put some on the next slide. But if ever in doubt, you could say the Times newspaper. And your answer could be a journalist from the Times might have written about. Because realistically, anything that's the Times, this is a national newspaper, they could easily have written an article about one of the things that you're trying to look at. And journalists were interested in some of the things, especially in a place like Whitechapel. So these are some sources that you're expected to know. Housing and employment records, council records, census returns, Charles Booth's survey. He was a researcher who spent a lot of his own money sending researchers, people to interview people in Whitechapel to find out about the problem of poverty. And one of the things he did with his research is they drew up maps, and on their maps they color-coded Whitechapel, and they had a certain colour for the poorest parts of Whitechapel and a different colour for some of the wealthier parts. So it's really useful for us as historians. We can see where some of the poorest areas, what the poorest areas of Whitechapel were. Local police records, always be specific about H division for that if you're using that as a source. Coroner's reports, photographs, London newspapers. The one I always use is the East London Observer. National sources, national newspapers. I always use the Times. Records of crimes and police investigations, Old Bailey records of trials, and Punch cartoons. Punch cartoons are very good at showing us public attitudes at the time, but we know always Punch cartoons are massively exaggerated, so they do sometimes exaggerate some of the potential issues about Whitechapel, but it's very good for showing us public attitudes. Section B is the Crime and Punishment 1000 to present part of the paper. So you've got to be really mindful when you do this part of the course that there are 4 time periods. Medieval period 1000 to 1500, and the medieval period is split up into Anglo-Saxon, Norman and later Middle Ages. The early modern 1500 to 1700, industrial 1700 to 1900, and then the modern day 1900 to present, so that's 2025 as of today. You also must be clear on the different categories. There are 3. Laws, crimes. So this is sometimes referred to as definitions of crime, and you've got to be thinking about crimes against person, property and authority, and also be aware of what a social crime is. These are crimes that people in the society don't believe are serious crimes. Law enforcement, and there are 2 types of law enforcement: community based or authorities, so being kind of run by the government, the monarch, etc. And then finally, punishment. And we've got 3 main aims of punishment: deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation. So there are loads and loads of laws and crimes, and especially depending on which textbook you're using, some of the textbooks go into so much detail. This revision video here, I'm just actually focusing on the stuff that Edexcel mentioned in specification, but be mindful that there might be some other examples that you could add in. So, laws and crimes. They often refer to this as definitions of crime, and this is quite simply what was illegal and what was legal at the time. We've got crimes against the person. This would be stuff like murder or assault. Crimes against property would be stuff like arson or theft, and crimes against authority, we're talking about stuff like treason, heresy, etc. So the key change in the medieval period is the forest laws were introduced by William I. However, so if you're caught hunting in the royal forest, that's the crime of poaching, and this was seen to be a social crime. People believed that this was a really unfair law. In the early modern period, the 4 main crimes laws we're going to talk about will be heresy. Heresy is the crime of going against the established religion of the country. This becomes so problematic in the early modern period because of the Reformation and the split between Protestantism and Catholicism. Treason is also an issue. In this period, the monarch now becomes head of the church. So what ends up happening is that if you commit heresy in this period, you are technically now committing treason because the monarch is the head of the church. So that's also a problem. The key example of treason as well is not just linked to heresy, but it's also the gunpowder plot. Vagabondage becomes a big issue. We have a growing population at this time, and therefore this puts pressure on resources such as jobs, food, land, and we get an increase in poverty. The authorities are worried about this. They don't want to put in the resources to necessarily solve this, and so they treat people very harshly as a result, and they criminalize begging, and that becomes known as vagabondage. And witchcraft as well is one of the key crimes in this period. In the industrial period, highway robbery becomes a big issue as more and more people are travelling around the country. As the country changes and goes through the Industrial Revolution, more and more people are travelling, and as a result we get the problem of highway robbery. Poaching, this is still a problem linking back to the forest laws, and in this period it's because wealthier landowners are closing off their land, and they're no longer going to allow other people to use their land for stuff like taking resources, hunting, etc. So poaching becomes a bigger problem, and that's going to be linked to the 1723 Black Act. Smuggling is a big issue as the government introduced import duties, taxes on goods from abroad, and the way I always remember this is, can we stop licking soap? Cloth, wine, leather. Can we stop sugar or spirits, and then leather and soap? I messed that up big time, but yeah, can we stop licking soap? We also get the end of witchcraft as people become less superstitious. There's more of a focus on scientific understanding. People become more rational, and we get these big scientific breakthroughs. So, for example, we get the Royal Society in this period here. So people are more focused on science and less superstitious. No more witchcraft accusations. In the modern day period, so the key things you need to know. Theft continues, but it's completely different to, say, early modern or industrial theft. A lot of it is now being done online with online fraud. Copyright theft, a lot of that is now being done online, and identity theft is a big issue. Key thing here, internet is a game changer for theft. We still get smuggling, but it's very different. Now we're getting Class A drugs being smuggled into Britain, cocaine, heroin, for example. Also, we're no longer getting stuff like cloth and wine being smuggled in. There's also people trafficking, which is an issue. So these are examples of old crimes that have just changed in terms of the way that they're committed. But they're not completely new crimes, but there are some completely new crimes. Driving offences. Clearly, in the early modern period, people were not driving big metal cars around. They didn't need to have special laws about that. Drug crimes. Obviously, this is changed because drugs only become illegal in the 1970s. And we get race crimes. As Britain's population has changed, they've had to introduce laws, for example, in order to protect other groups of people who might be facing discrimination. Law enforcement. This is the ways that you just catch people who have broken the law. Now, two categories of this, either community or authority-based. In the medieval period, it's mainly community-based. Hue and cry, tithings, classic examples of community, but also we do get some authority law enforcement. So parish constables were just people from the local, say, village or wider area who would ensure that hue and cry and tithing is being followed. You do also get justices of the peace who are also appointed by the monarch. Early modern period, it is still very much community-based in rural areas, but the population is changing to a certain degree, and we're getting more people living in towns. In towns, community-based law enforcement does not work in the same way, so hue and cry and tithing, they're not used in the same way. Town constables are now people who are going to be appointed by the authorities in order to help this. You still get forms of community-based law enforcement though. You get people like from the local community doing night watch, staying up at night as well. In the industrial period, we get the Fielding brothers from the local community who set up their own police force called the Bow Street Runners, but this is not being run by the authorities. They do end up getting paid by the government in 1785, but there's a big turning point in 1829 because the authorities, the government at the time, they pretty much take over policing in London in 1829 by setting up the London Metropolitan Police, which is the Metropolitan Police Act. So as I say, big turning point, 1829, the government is now running policing in London, and that actually spreads to the rest of the country from 1856 and also 1878. And that continues in the modern period. Policing is mainly done by the authorities. The vast majority of our policing is being done by the authorities. The police have changed. They now are more specialised. They are focusing not so much on just catching criminals, but preventing criminals in the first place and stopping people being victims of crime. They've also had a massive shift with a focus on science and technology. Think about all of the technology the police use today. For example, breathalyzers, CCTV, forensics, etc. However, we get a little bit of a community role still with neighbourhood watch. Punishment. So, 3 types of punishment: deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation. Deterrence is a punishment designed to put people off committing crimes. Retribution is a punishment designed to make the person suffer. It's got a revenge element, and I always think about retribution as being particularly violent and quite shocking as well. Rehabilitation is this sense that you want to give the criminal a second chance, but there's also an element that you want to improve the person. So you're going to give them a punishment that's not only going to give them a second chance, but actually they're going to come out as a better person as a result of this punishment. So in the medieval period, we don't really talk about rehabilitation. We've got deterrence and retribution are key. Fines are used, such as vergeld. That's not really retribution, is it? It's not particularly violent. Corporal and capital punishment, clearly there's a retribution element to it. Some of the corporal punishment is particularly violent. So for example, eye gouging, I would say that's retribution. But say maybe someone being kind of like beaten or whipped, I don't know, maybe you'd say that's not fully retribution, that's maybe more of a deterrence. And capital punishment, you'd have to say that's retribution. But even within that, you might say some capital punishment is just quite quick, it's not particularly violent. Some might argue that, say, hanging someone is not actually retribution. Hang, drawn and quartered, which is technically introduced in this period, that's got to be retribution. That's designed to make the person really suffer. Early modern, we still have this corporal and capital punishment being used, but we get two new punishments. Well, transportation to Australia. It shows that they're trying to maybe move a little bit away from just murdering, using the death penalty. The Bloody Code, however, they do have the Bloody Code introduced in 1688, which is the increased use of the death penalty. So they're trying to be a bit more inventive, but you'd say there's still this real focus on deterrence and retribution here. Now, it's only in the industrial period where we do actually get a shift to rehabilitation, although I would say to a certain extent they've not completely got rid of deterrence and retribution. So we get rid of the Bloody Code, and that the person that's key in doing that is Robert Peel. So Bloody Code is ended in about 1823. So they're no longer going to use the death penalty unless it's for more serious crimes. They also then get rid of transportation in 1868 and public executions. Transportation was seen to be too lenient for some people, too nice, too harsh for some people, and the third reason they get rid of it is Australians were complaining. Public executions were just not taken seriously by the public. Remember, there's that carnival atmosphere, prostitution, pickpocketing, people getting really drunk. So in this period, we get a real shift to rehabilitation, and the main form of punishment is going to be prisons. So the 1823 Jails Act by Peel is one of the things that Edexcel really focus on, and that's going to pay jailers. It's going to mean that prisoners are no longer kept in chains. Women and children will be kept separate, and men as well. And they're just trying to improve the condition of the prisons. And this then leads to the construction of Pentonville Prison in North London. And Pentonville does have some pretty modern things. So for example, it's got ventilation, mechanical ventilation, it's got toilets in the basins in the cells. So in the modern day period. So they keep the focus on prisons. We still really think of that as our main form of punishment for criminals, but they make the prisons better. So there's no hard labour and there's no separate system, which was key to Pentonville previously. They introduced a new type of prison in the 1930s called open prisons, which means that well-behaved prisoners, people who are coming to the end of their prison sentence, will actually be allowed out in the day to work, and then they can come back at night. And they're trying to ensure that people are getting used to living in an outside world, so when they do go out, it won't be such a shock. Young people are no longer sent to prisons with adults. So for example, we've got youth offenders institutions such as Borstals, which later will become known as juvenile detention centres. In the 1960s, we get the abolition of the death penalty. 1965 is the date that I use, although some would say it's 1969. Key thing is the Derek Bentley case study with that. But we also now don't just use prison. We don't just take people into custody. We use non-custodial alternatives such as electronic tagging. But definitely you'd say that there has been a big shift, and now we really do focus on rehabilitation. Retribution is not really part of our aims. So in terms of some case studies, throughout the course. So in the medieval period, you need to know about the medieval role of the church. And I think it's fair to say that the medieval church is very important, it's significant, it's a key part of English society, but it wasn't completely rational. It's not completely based on evidence, so trial by ordeal is quite random. Benefit of clergy was just unfair. It meant that people who worked for the church, the clergy, could just get away with a less harsh punishment for committing the same crimes as normal people. And sanctuary meant that certain people, if they lived near one of these special sanctuary churches, could just escape being caught. So it didn't necessarily make sense, you'd have to say. Early modern period, we talk about the gunpowder plotters. Also, we talked about witchcraft as well. And so for that, you'd have to talk about Matthew Hopkins as well. In the industrial period, we talk about Tolpuddle martyrs. Tolpuddle martyrs show that the authorities did try to treat these people, these farm labourers who had asked for a pay rise, quite harshly, but it's a very good example of how public attitudes have become more important because the public put pressure on the government with protests, petitions and marches, and eventually the government had to pardon the Tolpuddle martyrs who had been sentenced to transportation, and they get brought back to Britain. Robert Peel, he's key for setting up prisons, Pentonville Jails Act, police, Metropolitan Police Act, and also he repeals the bloody code. Pentonville also, you need to know about that. That's a key example of they're improving the key thing with Pentonville is the physical health of the prisoners has improved massively. However, the mental health of the prisoners is not prioritised. They're with the separate system. They're not allowed to talk to anyone. They're kept completely separate. That leads to some serious problems such as psychosis, suicide, and high levels of depression. In a modern day period, we look at the conscientious objectors. So attitudes towards them from the government. In the First World War, conscientious objectors, people who refused to fight for the British, they were treated harshly by the government. So they could be sentenced to prison. In some rare extreme cases, they could get the death penalty. And the public treated them badly as well. They were ostracised, they were treated badly. People didn't like them. In the Second World War, it's different because the government treats them a bit better and just finds them alternative work, not sending them to prison, but the public still in World War II treat them really badly. Derek Bentley is a key case study with the end of the death penalty because his execution was very controversial and people believe that this was a bit of a miscarriage of justice and he shouldn't have faced the death penalty. So, for all of these changes, I want you to think about grips. Grips is what you could be using, especially in those 12 markers. So what are the factors that have explained why this stuff has just changed? Why it hasn't just stayed the same since the medieval period? First thing is to talk about the role of government, monarch, and authorities. So some of the key monarchs we might look at: James I. Religion, the role of religion and the church. Individuals, the role of individuals. Public. Population, so this is all about the population changing as population just grows, but also more people moving from rural areas to urban areas. And science and technology, so that would be grips. So in terms of the first part of grips, you could be thinking about monarchs, government, key government figures. William I. You could talk about people like James I, Robert Peel in the industrial period, and you could also talk about the role of the government with the conscientious objectors. Role of religion, well certainly that's going to be key in the medieval period, but you could also link religion and the church to heresy and the gunpowder plotters, and also in the industrial period, Fry and Howard are prison reformers who are definitely influenced by their Christian faith in terms of trying to focus on a more like humanitarian and fairer approach to treating prisoners. Role of individuals, William I. In the medieval period, early modern, Matthew Hopkins is a key individual. Industrial period, Tolpuddle martyrs, Fielding brothers, who set up the Bow Street Runners, Fry, Howard, Robert Peel. And in the modern period, an individual could be Derek Bentley. Role of public attitudes and community. Well, in the medieval period, we know that the community was key. Certainly in the early modern period, people were very superstitious, which leads to the witch hunts. You could talk about different beliefs, about religious beliefs leads to heresy. In the industrial period, we could talk about people's reaction to the Tolpuddle martyrs, people not taking the bloody code seriously. And in the modern day period, we can still talk about community stuff with like the neighbourhood watch and how people were angry with conscientious objectors, even in World War II when the government was less harsh. There's some other stuff on the screen there, which you can have a read of. Final one, population growth. Well, certainly in the early modern period, we get more people living in towns, which means that community-based law enforcement will not be so effective. Also leads to vagabondage and witchcraft as well. In the industrial period, we get more crime in cities, which leads to the Bow Street Runners being set up. More crime leads to the CID as well. Growth in towns also means that we're going to get highway robbery as people travel between these towns. Science and technology, we don't really talk about it in the medieval period, but the printing press helps to spread ideas in books about witchcraft and vagabondage. Industrial period, we could talk about handwriting analysis used by CID. Science and rational thinking leads to the end of the witch hunt. Pentonville has loads of technology. Mechanical ventilation, heating, toilet spaces. But the key thing for science and technology is definitely going to be in the modern period. So the police use loads of science and technology. CCTV, forensics, fingerprinting, DNA, electronic tagging is used as a punishment. Our better understanding of stuff like drugs and the addictive nature and the impacts on the body has led to them being criminalized, stuff like cocaine, heroin, from the 1970s. So the types of questions for this, they really want you to think about what were the most significant events, people, or changes. In each time period, was there lots of change or was there mainly continuity? Continuity is just the absence of change when stuff hasn't changed that much. And what were the most important reasons for the changes? And obviously for that, you can link to grips. Law enforcement, you want to be thinking, was it community-based, authority-based? And punishments, thinking, was it about deterrence, retribution, or rehabilitation? So some examples of some questions. So first for marker, they're going to ask you to compare two time periods and give you a topic, and they want you to think, was it similar or different? The next one is going to be the 12 marker, where they'll give you an explain why question. For this, you must always identify the time period and you must identify the category and the topic. And you're just thinking about 3 reasons, and you're really thinking about 3 examples as well, why these changes have happened. And for that, you're going to link to the grips factors again. Then, final bit of the paper, you will get a choice of a 16 marker to write. So you get choice of 2. So for this, the same thing, you must always identify the time period really clearly and the category. Try and write about 3 examples, show off detailed knowledge, names, places, dates, facts and figures. Now the key difference between a 12 marker and a 16 marker is this 12 marker you just need to explain why something changed. With the 16 marker, they will give you a statement and you have to give your opinion. So in your introduction, you must clearly state what you think. Don't sit on the fence, have a clear argument and stick with that. And you're going to repeat this argument, this judgment in each paragraph. And you're then going to restate it in the conclusion. So for this, you are going to look at both sides of the question. So for example, this question here, it's saying, was the idea of retribution the main factor in the medieval period? Well, you're going to write a paragraph about retribution and say why that was significant and why that was important for medieval punishment. But you're also going to write a paragraph about deterrence. And you're actually going to say, however, there were some punishments that could be linked to deterrence. And I would say for this, by the way, I don't think retribution was the main factor. It was a key part of medieval punishment, but I would say actually deterrence was key because there were quite a few punishments that weren't particularly violent. Fines would be a great example of that, for example. And then this, say, would be the second example here. You're going to use the same formula. Key thing with this is be brave, come up with a judgment, and just stick to that throughout. But do also look at the other side of the argument so that you've got a balanced argument.